the gladiator who became Rome's first transgender celebrity. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story from the streets and arenas of ancient Rome, a story of fame, fortune, and identity in a time when neither were as straightforward as we might imagine today. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe sip something warm, and let us float into the dusty echoes of the amphitheater, because tonight we meet someone quite extraordinary. Our story starts in the 2nd century AD, in a remote forested corner of Germania, where a young warrior named Hercula was born. Her family were simple villagers. Nothing noble or particularly impressive, but the Romans had a habit of noticing anyone who could swing a sword without breaking it, or perhaps anyone they could enslave and send to fight for their entertainment. So Hercula was captured by Roman raiders, likely screaming and flailing in ways that would have made any modern human resources manager clutch their pearls and sigh heavily. Thrown into the vast world of gladiators, Hercula had little choice but to adapt quickly to survive. Some gladiators trained in the classic styles, the Murmillo and the Ricciarius, while others became exotic attractions. With an unusual flair for dramatic costumes and elaborate fighting choreography, Hercula was, by most accounts, not the fastest, but possessed a strange combination of agility and daring that drew the eyes of the trainers and eventually the crowds. It was suggested by a few chroniclers that the decision to fight as a female gladiator was partly strategic because the novelty alone would make the audience pay attention and pay extra. So Hercula donned a metal bikini, which was, of course, incredibly uncomfortable, especially when sweating, under the unforgiving Roman sun, and stepped into the arena. The nickname she received from the crowd was simple enough: Hercula the Dazzling, though some spectators added subtler jabs about how dangerous it was to bet on someone so flamboyantly dressed. It must be said that the entire spectacle of a female gladiator was shocking to Roman sensibilities, and yet incredibly profitable for the sponsors who enjoyed raking in coin from curious spectators. Hercula fought an astonishing 47 matches and surprisingly won every single one. They were never the kind of match that ended with dramatic bloodletting, but rather victories achieved through clever maneuvers, endurance, and an uncanny ability to anticipate an opponent's strategy. Fans loved it, and graffiti began appearing across the empire, the most famous being in Pompeii that declared Hercula had bigger balls than Nero, a phrase that seems oddly timeless in its sarcastic bite, and yet in context was considered high praise. Roman culture loved heroes, but also loved spectacle and gossip, and Hercula was the perfect storm of both. The Emperor Commodus took notice because why not double down on a celebrity who could entertain the masses and perhaps serve as a source of amusement at private parties? So Hercula was invited to dine with the emperor, who apparently enjoyed the combination of charm, combat stories, and sheer audacity of the young gladiator. It is said that at these banquets, Hercula would casually recount her victories while subtly mocking other more traditional guests who believed themselves superior merely by birthright. But here's where our story starts to twist in ways that make modern historians pause and then quietly chuckle. Hercula had always known something about herself that she could not fully express in the rough and brutal world of the arena. Namely, that her identity was not fully female, nor strictly male, but somewhere fluid along the spectrum of what Romans understood at the time, though there were no labels. In the sense we have today, the desire to present as a man eventually became undeniable. After years of earning prize money and performing in front of thousands, Hercula bought her freedom, a feat that required both careful saving and a fair amount of negotiation with her former trainers and sponsors. Imagine haggling over emancipation in ancient Rome while trying to keep your dignity intact and not anger the mob that now adored you. It took patience, but eventually Hercula was free and could transition in the most public, yet somehow understated way possible. She assumed the name Hercules Maximus and began living fully as a man. The transformation was not merely a social one, it involved clothing gestures, posture, and the subtle performance of masculinity. In the eyes of her contemporaries, some of her old fans adjusted quickly, others took time to reconcile the person they had cheered for in a bikini with the man they now saw walking the streets of Rome. It seems Hercula, or Hercules Maximus as we must now call him, was less concerned with public approval and more interested in living authentically, even if it meant confusing everyone from senators to tavern gossip. Interestingly enough, the legacy of Hercules Maximus was immortalized in multiple forms. Graffiti continued to celebrate both personas, acknowledging a singular hero who defied easy categorization. Marble statues were erected, showing him first as the fierce female gladiator and then later in full male attire, sword in hand, as if to say one body, one spirit, and a life lived on their own terms. It is unclear who commissioned these statues, but one suspects either devoted fans or perhaps even Commodus himself, who had a curious taste for remarkable personalities. Hercules Maximus also continued to be part of social life with the elite of Rome, which is remarkable considering the rigid social hierarchies in place at the time. Dinner parties, discussions, and philosophical debates were all part of the daily rotation of a freed gladiator, now socially fluid and still as charismatic as ever. His story spread like wildfire through the city and beyond and eventually became the stuff of legend. Whispered in bathhouses and taverns across the empire, when Hercules Maximus passed away, the devotion of his fans remained evident. They buried him with both a sword and a mirror, a combination that seems peculiar to modern eyes, but perfectly encapsulates the duality he embraced in life. The sword a nod to his prowess in the arena, the mirror a quiet celebration of identity and self-recognition. It was, in many ways, the original they-them legend, the kind that no chronicler could entirely capture in words, but everyone felt the weight of in person. And so our tale drifts into the annals of history, not with the usual pomp or bloodshed, but with a calm, quiet reflection on courage and authenticity in a world that often demands conformity. Hercules Maximus may have fought with steel in hand, but it was their courage to live openly that truly carved a place in Roman memory. Alright, so now that Hercules Maximus has stepped into freedom, let us settle back into the rhythm of ancient Rome. It was a city of marble, columns, noisy markets, and more gossip than you could shake a stick at. The streets were dusty, the air smelled faintly of olives and sweat, and everywhere you turned someone was either plotting a political coup or shouting at a charioteer who had the audacity to slightly misjudge a turn. It was in this environment that our hero would continue to exist, not as a mere gladiator, but as a celebrity who defied the neat little boxes society tried to place people, and Hercules Maximus found himself invited to an odd assortment of events. The first were private parties thrown by Commodus, who as we know had a penchant for theatrics and self-indulgence. It must have been exhausting to attend these gatherings, considering that the emperor often had little patience for subtlety or nuance. Commodus preferred spectacle, so Hercules Maximus was both the star and the curiosity of every banquet. Everyone wanted to see the gladiator who could fight like a hero and live like a mystery. Meanwhile, the streets of Rome continued to celebrate the dual legacy. Graffiti was inscribed in places both high and low, proclaiming admiration, sometimes admiration with a hint of shock. Some messages were straightforward, while others had the kind of dry wit that could make a historian smile centuries later. Pompeii, in particular, had multiple mentions of Hercules Maximus, some praising combat skill, others marveling at the audacity of someone who could inhabit two forms of identity with such confidence. The phrase about having bigger balls than Nero continued to circulate, which of course amused everyone and embarrassed the occasional moralist Hercules. Maximus took a subtle approach to daily life. He did not flaunt wealth extravagantly, though he certainly could have indulged. He preferred simpler clothing than senators expected, choosing attire that allowed freedom of movement, a nod to the gladiatorial past, and perhaps an insistence on not letting the performative expectations of Rome dominate him entirely. The hair was carefully maintained, the posture deliberate, and even his speech carried a rhythm that suggested calm control rather than the frenzied boasting typical of those with newfound social status. Now one might assume that a freed gladiator living among the elites would be constantly stressed or overwhelmed, but Hercules Maximus developed routines that grounded him in a world that was otherwise chaotic. Morning walks along the Tiber, where he could watch the merchants arguing over fish, afternoon training sessions to maintain strength and dexterity. Late evening discussions on philosophy and ethics with anyone curious enough to ask about his experiences. A life structured in rhythm and reflection, though always with the awareness that public curiosity was never far behind. Of course, there were challenges because Rome did not easily accommodate someone living outside expected norms. There were whispers in certain political circles, a senator here or there making pointed comments about propriety, but the beauty of Hercules Maximus lay in the quiet defiance of living authentically while letting society squirm quietly around it. He did not need to lecture or confront. The mere act of existing fully as he chose was sufficient disruption to polite expectations. Some historians have speculated about personal relationships during this period. The truth is, fragments remain in letters, inscriptions, and secondary accounts suggesting that Hercules Maximus had companions, both romantic and platonic, though never publicly displayed in a way that would draw scandal. He moved through these relationships with the same measured grace as he did through the arena, always aware of optics, but never fully controlled by them. This allowed him a surprising degree of privacy for someone whose image was so widely celebrated. Hercules Maximus also engaged with other gladiators who had retired or been freed. Some came seeking advice, some came merely to reminisce about the brutal and sometimes absurd world of the arena. There was a sense of camaraderie among those who had survived, and now had to navigate freedom in a city that was more complicated than any training yard or sand-filled pit. Some afternoons might be spent in quiet sparring where no spectators watched, just movement, muscle, and respect. It was a private echo of the life that had propelled him to fame. One fascinating aspect of this story is the artistic commemoration statues were commissioned by admirers, both wealthy and anonymous. Some depicted Hercula, the female warrior, with precise detailing of the metal bikini, emphasizing skill rather than sexualization. Others depicted Hercules Maximus as a man strong and poised with sword in hand, marble gleamed under Roman sun and shadows, played across musculature and expression, capturing subtle confidence rather than exaggerated heroics. Both forms existed in public spaces side by side as a testament to a life that refused simple categorization. It was less a statement about gender and more a statement about courage, audacity, and self-definition. In addition to statues, graffiti, and banquets, Hercules Maximus occasionally visited baths, which were social hubs and centers of informal news. Rome being what it was meant that the whispers about him spread quickly, often distorted and exaggerated, but always maintaining the kernel of admiration. He could float quietly through the steam and marble corridors and encounter citizens young and old exchanging stories about the gladiator who had fought in a bikini then lived as a man. The social fabric of Rome absorbed him, and yet did not fully contain him, which seems precisely how he intended it. And then there were the practical matters of survival, which are easy to overlook when focusing on spectacle. Fame and celebrity are amusing, but money, food, and security are not negotiable. Hercules Maximus managed finances with care, occasionally lending to friends or investing in small properties that provided both income and stability. This was an unusual sophistication for a freed gladiator, though perhaps the years spent navigating contracts for matches, prizes, and personal safety had taught him skills beyond simple swordplay. Everything from negotiating payment to avoiding scandal required careful attention and a steady hand. So life rolled along. In this rhythm, quiet training, public curiosity, private reflection, and artistic commemoration, a life extraordinary in its simplicity yet remarkable because of the audacity of living fully free within a city that often demanded conformity. Heroes in Rome were usually defined by conquest politics or ancestry. Hercules Maximus carved a different path defined by choice, personal courage, and the refusal to be reduced to spectacle alone. So as the city of Rome churned on with its noisy streets, merchants hawking everything from olives to exotic fish and philosophers gesturing dramatically at anyone who would listen, Hercules Maximus moved through it all with the same steady rhythm that had carried him. Through the arenas of his youth, people stared occasionally, sometimes whispered, but mostly they admired. It was the kind of quiet fame that did not demand attention, but could not be ignored either. Even in leisure, Hercules Maximus maintained certain habits reminiscent of his gladiatorial days. Morning training remained important, not for survival this time, but for self-discipline, and a lingering sense of control over a body that had been tested countless times in the sands of the arena. The exercises were precise and measured with stretching and footwork, often performed in the private courtyard of a modest villa acquired after careful negotiation with a retiring gladiator who had sold it for coin and good humor. There was little pomp about it, no need to impress anyone with flash or noise, just the satisfaction of competence. Socially, he was fascinating to both the elite and ordinary citizens alike. Though formal banquets with senators and minor nobles occurred, he also spent time in less glamorous settings, taverns, baths, and marketplaces, where the pulse of the city was felt more honestly. The ability to listen, quietly watch, and sometimes interject with subtle humor made him a beloved presence in these spaces. The kind of fame that came with celebrity often attracts sycophants, but Hercules Maximus managed to filter them with minimal effort, observing human nature. Like a sport rather than a burden, art continued to play a large role in cementing his legacy both intentionally and unintentionally. Some wealthy patrons commissioned sculptures and mosaics depicting Hercules Maximus in action or repose, while ordinary citizens painted or scratched images into walls capturing either the fierce female gladiator or the confident man with a sword. These works were never entirely celebratory in a simplistic sense they often carried subtle commentary, humor, and a faint disbelief that someone could inhabit two forms of identity with such quiet authority. Statues of Hercules Maximus sometimes stood beside fountains or in courtyards, and while the marble gleamed in sunlight, shadows would dance across curves and musculature, highlighting the duality and fluidity that made him unique. In quieter moments, Hercules Maximus reflected on his unusual trajectory. Few people could truly grasp the emotional weight of moving from captivity to celebrity to a liberated life lived authentically. He was aware of his privilege but never flaunted it, a characteristic that distinguished him from many other freed gladiators, who often sought ostentation and social climbing. Life had taught him subtlety and patience, and he applied these skills not only in social circles but also in personal reflection, observing the rhythms of the city and occasionally meditating on his own existence. Romantic relationships were carefully navigated affairs, though they remain partially mysterious to historians. Few explicit records survive, but letters and marginal notes suggest a combination of deep companionship and occasional fleeting encounters. Some were with other freed individuals, some with citizens of status fascinated by his persona, but all conducted in a way that balanced intimacy and public discretion. A modern observer might marvel at how he managed both public curiosity and private desire without apparent scandal. It seems Hercules Maximus had mastered the art of being observed without being consumed by observation. Bathhouses were an important part of this social ecosystem, and Hercules Maximus frequented them regularly. The steam and warm water allowed relaxation, conversation, and observation. It was here that he would hear gossip from citizens, young and old, stories of his feats in the arena, and commentary on his recent appearances in public. Some stories exaggerated events wildly, while others provided an affectionate nod to his skill and audacity. Sometimes he would smile quietly at absurd tales and occasionally contribute subtle clarifications, without undermining the narrative charm surrounding his legend. Of course, challenges arose along the way. Even a beloved public figure had to navigate political sensitivities and occasional jealousy. Commodus and other members of the elite occasionally displayed subtle antagonism or passive aggression, but Hercules Maximus was careful not to provoke unnecessary drama. Instead, he relied on charm, intelligence, and the occasional strategic retreat to maintain equilibrium and avoid confrontations that could spiral unnecessarily. This required a combination of intuition and experience gained from surviving an arena that demanded life or death decisions. Beyond the city social scene, there were quiet excursions into the countryside, perhaps to visit family or other ex-gladiators who had retired quietly from public life. These excursions allowed reflection and a reminder of the path from captivity to freedom. It also reinforced his physical agility and the discipline that had been cultivated in the arena. These trips were often brief, but allowed him to reconnect with the natural rhythms of the land and the simple satisfaction of moving through it freely. Hercules Maximus also had a subtle influence on culture and public imagination. The story of a gladiator who could inhabit multiple identities resonated across Rome and even into the provinces. Rumors of his exploits spread to nearby towns and settlements where young men and women would whisper tales of the daring gladiator who had fought with grace and then lived authentically as a man. Some may have dismissed these stories as exaggeration, yet the repetition and consistency of accounts suggest that his presence had a tangible impact on cultural consciousness and social imagination. In addition to these more abstract influences, there were practical aspects of daily life. Hercules Maximus remained attentive to finances, investing in modest properties and helping friends who were struggling. He managed his affairs with the careful strategy of a tactician from the arena, balancing risk and security. A freed gladiator with financial acumen was rare enough that this added to his reputation as someone extraordinary not only in physical skill and personal identity, but also in intellect and prudence. So day after day, Hercules Maximus moved through the city life in a rhythm familiar and yet unique, balancing past and present fame, privacy, and observation. He was a figure both ordinary and exceptional, capable of walking the streets without drama, yet impossible to ignore. His legacy in graffiti, statues, public memory, and private admiration continued to grow organically. The story of a gladiator who fought in a metal bikini, then lived authentically as a man, was unusual yet quietly compelling, not because of violence or spectacle, but because of courage ordinary humans often only dream of attempting. Now let us float gently into the middle years of Hercules Maximus. Life by this point, he had established a rhythm that balanced fame, privacy, and social curiosity with remarkable skill. Rome itself continued to churn around him. The streets noisy with carts, hawkers shouting over each other, and the occasional philosopher gesturing dramatically at anyone who seemed to listen. Life in the city remained chaotic in ways that contrasted sharply with his carefully maintained calm. Hercules Maximus had by now become a fixture of Roman culture not merely as a gladiator or celebrity, but as a symbol of audacity and subtle rebellion against the rigid norms of society. Ordinary citizens continued to inscribe graffiti praising his dual legacy. Murals and statues appeared in unexpected places, some commissioned by admirers, others simply carved by fascinated youths who had grown up hearing exaggerated tales of his exploits. The combination of humor, admiration, and disbelief in these works created a persistent legend, one that was difficult to ignore, even for those who had never seen him in person. Socially, he continued to navigate elite circles, though with increasing confidence. The banquets of Commodus remained. Frequent invitations, though, often slightly more controlled than in his earlier years. The emperor's interest was equal parts amusement and strategic spectacle. Having someone like Hercules Maximus present at events elevated the status of the host while simultaneously providing an oddly charming contrast to the rigid hierarchies typical of Roman gatherings. At these dinners, Hercules Maximus would speak sparingly, choosing words with precision, a subtle joke here, a calm observation there. The effect was mesmerizing to those with the patience to notice, yet even in such circles his presence carried implicit lessons about identity, courage, and self-definition. While some senators whispered or attempted subtle criticism, the hero's quiet composure ensured that little could stick without attracting ridicule from more perceptive onlookers. This may have been deliberate or simply a product of natural confidence cultivated through years of surviving physical and social arenas alike. Either way, Hercules Maximus became an embodiment of measured audacity, a reminder that some forms of influence require neither aggression nor overt spectacle. Outside the formal gatherings, private interactions continued to shape his reputation. Citizens young and old would recognize him in marketplaces, bathhouses, or public gardens, exchanging nods and whispers. Some sought advice on personal courage, others sought validation for choices that society discouraged. The balance between accessibility and privacy was delicate, yet Hercules Maximus managed it effortlessly, offering only what felt comfortable, while ensuring the admiration of many persisted. Without letting curiosity overwhelm his daily routine, artistic commemoration expanded subtly into literary forms too. A few minor poets composed lines celebrating his victories in the arena or his unique journey into freedom and authenticity. Some of these verses were playful, incorporating puns and witticisms, while others treated him with a rare solemnity. More importantly, these literary tributes emphasized not merely combat prowess but the quiet nobility of choosing one's path in life, a lesson that resonated beyond the arenas and villas into the hearts of ordinary Romans who read or overheard these verses. Hercules Maximus also maintained a degree of physical practice, reminiscent of his gladiatorial days. Though no longer a requirement for survival, he continued rigorous training with swords and shields, often with companions who had shared the harsh experience of the arena. Others observed and occasionally attempted to mimic his movements, though few could match the fluidity and precision he had cultivated over years of disciplined repetition. The act of training was itself a meditation, a reminder of the body as strength and the mind as capacity for focus. Even in these quiet routines, there were subtle interactions with family and former companions, some from Germania, others from various corners of the empire. Those connections maintained a sense of continuity and memory, a reminder that life existed both outside the spectacle and beyond the applause. At times, these gatherings involved reflection, storytelling, and gentle humor, often at the expense of their younger selves, who had been far less polished in both skill and judgment. These moments preserved a sense of grounded humanity amid the grandeur of public life. Romantic and social engagements remained a delicate dance. Though explicit records are sparse, it is clear that Hercules Maximus maintained relationships that were mutually respectful, discreet, and often enriching. These included companions who appreciated both his intellect and charisma rather than merely his fame. Some letters survive, hinting at correspondence rich with subtle humor, shared experience, and occasional practical advice on navigating the curious contradictions of Roman life. They indicate a life carefully managed to balance personal desire with social expectation. Hercules Maximus' influence also extended to younger gladiators and those newly freed individuals seeking guidance or mentorship. In quiet corners of villas and training yards, he would observe movement and strategy, offer subtle advice, and sometimes gently correct posture or approach, all with the quiet patience of someone who had survived extraordinary challenges, yet retained empathy and insight for those embarking on similar paths. The combination of mentorship, practical skill, and social acumen created a legacy beyond statues, graffiti, or casual admiration. Finally, were the reflective moments, the evenings when Rome's sun dipped low across the Tiber, casting long shadows through colonnades. Hercules Maximus would walk quietly alone, sometimes pausing at fountains or open courtyards. Observing the interplay of light and shadow, he seemed to consider the life he had navigated, the duality he embodied, and the quiet impact he had upon culture and consciousness. This was not a life defined by violent spectacle, but by resilience, subtle audacity, and measured courage. A life that persisted both in memory and material form long after the immediate excitement of the arena faded. As time passed, Hercules Maximus' presence in Rome became a quiet constant, almost like the flow of the Tiber itself, neither sudden nor dramatic yet impossible to ignore if one cared to pay attention. He continued to move through society with measured grace, blending the worlds of former gladiator street celebrity and respected freedman. The city remained noisy, chaotic, and full of spectacle, but he found ways to navigate its currents without losing his sense of autonomy. The arenas remained a point of fascination, though he no longer fought publicly. Instead, he observed younger gladiators with a critical eye. Some trained in the traditional styles, others performed as exotic attractions or novelty fighters. Many of these novices looked up to him with wide-eyed curiosity or whispered reverence. His advice was subtle, never patronizing. Sometimes it involved adjustments to footwork or timing. Other times it was philosophical reflections on courage, self-respect, and the importance of choosing one's path even when society demanded conformity. These lessons were delivered with a calm monotone that seemed to lull both listener and himself into contemplation. Despite fame, he maintained a relatively modest lifestyle. Living in a villa that had been carefully acquired and modestly maintained, he cultivated simplicity rather than ostentation. Daily routines were orderly morning training, afternoon walks, and occasional social visits with friends or former companions. Though he had the means to indulge extravagantly, he seemed to prefer control over excess, preferring subtle comfort to loud display. His persona was the kind that could inspire envy, yet rarely provoked outright resentment because it was quiet, deliberate, and lived on his own terms. Artistic commemoration continued in multiple forms, while statues and mosaics captured his dual identity. Graffiti across Rome and nearby towns recorded humorous observations and admiration. Poetry occasionally circulated, praising both the prowess of Hercula, the female gladiator, and the measured wisdom of Hercules Maximus, the man. Some of these works included exaggerated or playful statements designed to amuse and inspire both contemporaries and future generations. This combination of humor, admiration, and curiosity created a cultural footprint that persisted in surprising ways. Bathhouses remained an important venue for both observation and socialization. The steam and warm waters created spaces where conversations were more intimate than in public settings. In these environments, Hercules Maximus could float quietly among citizens and nobles alike, observing human behavior, offering small insights, or simply enjoying the rhythm of people's interactions. It was a subtle power, the kind that did not dominate rooms but left a lingering sense of presence and understanding. Romantic and personal relationships were conducted with care and discretion, though the details are sparse. Surviving letters and inscriptions hint at companions who appreciated him not for fame but for intellect, humor, and the quiet courage he embodied. These connections were maintained with respect and attention to privacy, allowing Hercules Maximus a degree of personal freedom uncommon for someone so publicly known. Observers of the time often remarked on his composure in matters of affection, and the ease with which he navigated social expectation. Mentorship continued to be a significant part of his life. He engaged with other freed gladiators or young aspirants navigating the complex world of post-arena existence. Some sought guidance on combat technique, others on negotiation, fame management, or the delicate balance between public perception and private identity. Hercules Maximus offered measured advice, rarely overtly directive, more like a slow guiding hand that allowed others to find their own path while benefiting from his experience and insight. Politics, though never a primary concern, occasionally intersected with his life. Even subtle hostility from senatorial circles or courtiers had to be handled with care. Though whispers and insinuations circulated, Hercules Maximus rarely engaged directly. Instead, he relied on timing, composure, and the gentle art of self-assured presence to deflect confrontation. His ability to inhabit public and private spaces with equal ease meant that envy rarely escalated beyond curiosity. Evenings were a time for reflection, quiet walks, and contemplation. Observing the interplay of light and shadow across streets and gardens, he would occasionally pause at fountains or open courtyards, Lost in thought, he considered the path from captivity to celebrated freedman, and the dual identity he carried so effortlessly, in a world that often demanded rigid labels. Hercules Maximus had cultivated a life defined by choice, resilience, and subtle influence rather than spectacle or domination. Interestingly, he seemed to cultivate a small but loyal network of friends and confidants. Many were former gladiators or freed individuals who had learned from him. Others were curious citizens inspired by his story. The interactions were deliberate, but relaxed, creating a form of social stability unusual for someone of public attention. He understood the rhythms of influence, and used them sparingly, choosing whom to trust and when to withdraw, a skill honed from years navigating both the arena and elite circles. Hercules Maximus' enduring appeal rested not on heroics or conquest, but on a quiet mastery of life itself. The duality of his existence, gladiator and freedman, female warrior and man, captured imagination and respect alike. His story persisted in both material culture and collective memory, not as a tale of spectacle, but as an example of courage, measured, deliberate, and profoundly human. It was a life that suggested authenticity could coexist with social expectation, and that influence need not shout to be felt. By this stage of life, Hercules Maximus had become something of a fixture in Rome, not merely for his past as a gladiator, but for the quiet authority he carried in every interaction. There was an effortless composure about him that made others pause without him ever raising his voice or performing a single dramatic gesture. The city itself remained chaotic as ever. Carts clattered over stone streets, vendors shouted over each other, and philosophers argued in public spaces, yet Hercules Maximus floated through it all with a steady rhythm. Daily routines remained carefully structured. Morning training continued, though never as intense as in his arena days. Footwork, sword practice, and balance exercises were performed methodically and often in solitude, allowing both mental and physical focus. He rarely competed or performed publicly, but there was a meditative quality to his exercises, a reminder that discipline was as much about self-mastery as it was about survival. In these quiet sessions, he would sometimes watch young gladiators or apprentices practice, their forms offering subtle corrections, gestures, or quiet observations without dominating the space. Socially, Hercules Maximus balanced curiosity and privacy with remarkable skill. Even among elites who had previously found his past both entertaining and scandalous, he maintained respect and subtle admiration. Invitations to banquets continued, though often more ceremonial than essential. He was careful to speak with deliberate, calm, choosing words that conveyed thoughtfulness and dry humor. Observers noted a wry tone in conversation that suggested both awareness and amusement at the absurdities of social expectation without ever needing to be. Confrontational graffiti and popular culture continued to preserve his legend. The walls of Pompeii and other towns carried inscriptions praising both Hercula the gladiator and Hercules Maximus, the man. Some were playful, others reverent, a mixture of admiration, astonishment, and humor. His legacy as both a public spectacle and a quietly influential figure persisted through art, literature, and word of mouth. The combination of dual identity, skill, and intelligence created a rare cultural footprint that transcended ordinary celebrity. Bathhouses and public spaces remained a venue for observation and social connection. Here, Hercules Maximus could encounter a wide variety of citizens from different social strata. Each interaction was measured, thoughtful, and often infused with subtle wit. He could float through the steam and warmth, observing human behavior, hearing gossip, and occasionally offering insight without drawing undue attention. His presence created a quiet sense of respect among those who noticed, a reminder that influence could exist without fanfare. Romantic and personal relationships were nuanced affairs. Letters and minor inscriptions suggest a mixture of companionship, intellectual engagement, and discreet intimacy. Hercules Maximus managed these connections with care, balancing affection and privacy. While details are sparse, it is clear that he valued mutual respect and personal authenticity over social expectation or performative attachment. This approach allowed him to maintain both emotional life and public composure without scandal or undue scrutiny. Mentorship was increasingly central to his daily life. He advised younger freed gladiators or aspiring apprentices navigating post-arena life, offering guidance on both practical matters and social nuance. Advice was delivered subtly, rather than prescriptively. Observers noted his ability to balance encouragement and critique with quiet patience, teaching lessons in life as much as in combat skill. His impact extended beyond physical training to include social navigation, personal identity, and strategic patience in a society that often demanded conformity. Politics, though peripheral, occasionally intersected with his life. Some senatorial circles and courtiers expressed subtle jealousy or passive hostility. Yet Hercules Maximus rarely engaged directly. Preferring instead to rely on the quiet power of presence and measured interaction, he understood when to withdraw, when to observe, and when to influence without spectacle. These skills were honed through years of surviving. Both the arena and the public eye. Evenings remained a time for reflection and observation as the sun dipped low. Across marble columns and the Tiber flowed calmly through the city. Hercules Maximus would walk quietly, absorbing the rhythms of life, watching shadows stretch and merge. Observing citizens young and old, he reflected on his unusual trajectory from captive gladiator to freed celebrity, living authentically. The duality of his life, the arena and the villa, the female warrior and the man, was a source of personal satisfaction and cultural fascination. Interestingly, Hercules Maximus cultivated small but loyal networks of friends and confidants. Many were former gladiators, others curious citizens inspired by his life story. Interactions were deliberate, relaxed, and respectful, creating a sense of stability unusual for someone so widely known. He understood timing, discretion, and subtle influence, choosing carefully whom to trust and when to withdraw from the attention of the crowd. His mastery of these dynamics reinforced both his personal freedom and cultural legacy. Finally, the enduring appeal of Hercules Maximus lay not in spectacle, violence, or conquest, but in the quiet mastery of life itself. His legacy persisted in graffiti statues, poetry, and conversation, not because of heroics, but because of authenticity, courage, and subtle influence. It was a life that suggested that identity could coexist with public expectation, and that influence need not shout to be noticed. People remembered not merely the victories in the arena, but the way he carried himself afterward, the measured audacity that made him remarkable even in a society obsessed with performance. As years passed, Hercules Maximus settled into a rhythm that blended routine, reflection, and quiet influence. The city continued to hum around him, markets remained loud and cluttered. Philosophers still gestured dramatically at anyone nearby, and chariots rattled through uneven streets, yet he seemed entirely unaffected by the noise or chaos. His life had become a measured series of choices, a deliberate choreography of presence, observation, and subtle intervention that few could truly emulate. Training remained central, though never in the brutal style of the arena anymore. He moved gracefully through exercises, designed to maintain flexibility, balance, and strength. Footwork, sword handling, and careful posture drills were performed in private courtyards or occasionally in secluded halls with fellow freed gladiators who sought guidance. He offered corrections and encouragement sparingly, choosing moments when patience and observation would have the greatest effect. His discipline was quietly rigorous, a meditative practice rather than a demonstration of power. Social engagements continued in a similarly measured way. Banquets with Commodus and other elites were part performance and part observation. Hercules Maximus spoke rarely, but with precision. A wry comment here, a gentle correction there. It was impossible not to notice the calm authority in his presence. People would remember him not because he dominated conversation, but because he carried a self-assuredness that was entirely optional, yet entirely compelling. Observers sometimes whispered about his skill in navigating social expectation without arrogance or overt display. Graffiti, inscriptions, and informal art continued to preserve his legend throughout the city and beyond. Pompeii remained a particularly vivid hub of praise, amusement, and astonishment. Citizens young and old carved, painted, and scrawled both admiration and playful commentary on his dual identity. Some depicted Hercula, the gladiator, with her metal bikini poised mid-strike. Others depicted Hercules Maximus, the man, confident and relaxed, sword in hand. These representations reflected curiosity, humor, and respect, blending the fantastical with reality in ways that persisted long after his presence faded from daily life. Bathhouses remained a significant venue for quiet observation and subtle interaction. The steam, warm waters, and chatter of patrons created a unique social environment. Here he could observe, participate, and occasionally intervene with insight or guidance without attracting unnecessary attention. The balance between accessibility and privacy allowed him to remain connected to the city's pulse while maintaining control over his own visibility. These spaces reinforced both his social intelligence and his awareness of human behavior. Romantic and personal life remained discreet but meaningful. Letters and inscriptions hint at companions who valued not only his fame but also his intelligence, humor, and integrity. Relationships were conducted with care, balancing affection with discretion. allowing him to maintain autonomy while forming genuine emotional connections. Observers occasionally speculated about his private life, but Hercules Maximus managed perception with ease, letting curiosity linger without exposing himself to unnecessary scrutiny. Mentorship became an increasingly important part of his daily life. Many sought guidance on post-arena existence, social navigation, or the subtleties of personal identity. Hercules Maximus offered advice calmly and sparingly, teaching both practical skills and philosophical lessons. Subtlety was key. He provided guidance without dominating decisions, allowing protégés to grow under observation while avoiding the pitfalls of undue influence. His presence in this context was simultaneously instructive and inspirational. Politics remained a peripheral concern, yet unavoidable at times. Whispers from senators and elite courtiers occasionally required deft navigation. Though some sought to provoke envy or rivalry, Hercules Maximus relied on calm observation, timing, and careful interaction rather than confrontation. He utilized patience and discretion, allowing subtle influence to persist without overt conflict. This skill had been honed from years of navigating both the arena and elite society, creating an almost imperceptible but enduring authority. Evenings continued to be a time for reflection and quiet observation. Walking through streets, gardens, and open courtyards, he often paused to observe shadows and light, human movement, and the interplay of daily life. His thoughts drifted from past victories to cultural impact, identity, and the subtleties of influence. He had learned to inhabit multiple roles simultaneously. Former gladiator, freedman, cultural icon, mentor, and private individual, navigating desire, attention, and autonomy. Interestingly, Hercules Maximus cultivated small but deeply loyal networks of friends and confidants. Some were fellow freed gladiators, others ordinary citizens inspired by his life. These relationships were carefully maintained with attention to discretion and mutual respect. The ability to balance public and private life, influence and independence, admiration and intimacy became a defining feature of his continued legacy. Ultimately, the enduring appeal of Hercules Maximus rested on his quiet mastery of life, not on spectacle, nor conquest, nor heroic violence, but on subtle authority, careful choice, and measured courage. His story persisted in graffiti, art, poetry, and oral narrative, not because of dramatic heroics, but because of authenticity, resilience, and the audacity to exist fully on his own terms. It was a life that suggested identity could be fluid, influence subtle, and courage quietly profound. By this point in life, Hercules Maximus had settled comfortably into the rhythm of existence that he had carefully cultivated over the years. He had developed a balance between public attention and private reflection that many would find enviable, yet difficult to replicate. The city of Rome continued its usual chaos. Carts rattled along cobblestones, vendors shouted across streets, and philosophers gestured at anyone who seemed mildly attentive, yet he moved through it all with a calm precision that made him feel almost untouchable. Training remained central, but it had shifted almost entirely into a form of meditative practice. Footwork, balance, sword handling, and subtle strength exercises were conducted quietly, either in courtyards or secluded rooms, with a small number of trusted companions who sought guidance from someone who had survived the extremes of the arena. The exercises were precise, deliberate, and unhurried, emphasizing control, awareness, and endurance rather than dramatic displays of power or skill. In these moments, Hercules Maximus seemed entirely absorbed in his own physical and mental equilibrium. Social life continued to be carefully managed. Banquets with the emperor and elite Romans persisted, though often ceremonial in nature. He spoke rarely, choosing words that were deliberate and measured. Subtle humor and dry wit were the trademarks of his conversational style, often leaving listeners quietly amused or thoughtfully reflective, rather than impressed by spectacle. Observers remarked on his ability to dominate attention without shouting or exaggerating. This quiet control of presence became a defining characteristic of his public persona. Graffiti, mosaics, and statues continued to commemorate his dual identity. These artistic forms captured both Hercula, the female gladiator, and Hercules Maximus, the man displaying skill, poise, and audacity. The artwork ranged from humorous commentary to serious admiration, reflecting a mix of public amazement, affection, and disbelief. Even decades after his early arena victories, these images persisted in popular memory, reinforcing the unusual cultural footprint he had established. Through both personal achievement and authenticity, bathhouses remained a significant venue for social observation and discreet interaction. The steam-filled rooms provided an opportunity to watch, listen, and occasionally offer subtle guidance without drawing attention, while many sought fame or recognition in these spaces. Hercules Maximus used them to remain grounded, observing human behavior, social dynamics, and the ebb and flow of conversation. His presence elicited quiet respect not through intimidation, but through the calm authority of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. Romantic and personal connections were subtle and discreet. Letters and minor inscriptions suggest relationships that were mutually respectful, emotionally engaging, and discreet. His companions valued intellect, humor, and the quiet courage he embodied rather than merely his fame or past exploits. These connections allowed him to maintain both intimacy and autonomy while avoiding social scrutiny and the complications that often accompany public attention. Mentorship remained an important part of his life. Freed gladiators and young aspirants sought his guidance on post-arena existence, social navigation, and personal identity. Hercules Maximus offered advice calmly, sometimes silently observing or making small gestures of correction or encouragement. His influence was both practical and philosophical, blending lessons on physical skill, self-discipline, and the subtle art of existing authentically in a world that demanded conformity politics. Though never central, occasionally intersected with his life. Some elite Romans and senators expressed subtle envy or criticism yet. Hercules Maximus navigated these interactions with patience and discretion. Rather than engaging in confrontation, he relied on observation, timing, and the quiet weight of presence, allowing influence to persist without overt action. His years of surviving both the arena and elite social circles had cultivated a rare skill in navigating complex human dynamics. Evenings were reserved for reflection and quiet walks, observing shadows, street activity, and public interactions provided a space to contemplate identity, legacy, and personal growth. He understood the subtle power of presence, the quiet impact of influence, and the importance of balancing freedom, authenticity, and social expectation. These walks reinforced a sense of calm continuity in a world otherwise noisy and unpredictable. Hercules Maximus continued to cultivate a loyal and discreet network of friends and confidants. Many were former gladiators, others ordinary citizens inspired by his life story. Relationships were managed with care, balancing engagement with discretion, admiration with genuine connection. This network allowed him to exert subtle influence without being consumed by fame or expectation, creating a durable social foundation. Ultimately, the enduring appeal of Hercules Maximus rested on the quiet mastery of life itself. His legend persisted in graffiti, statues, mosaics, poetry, and oral narrative, not because of dramatic heroics, but through authenticity, courage, and deliberate choice living, fully and deliberately in both public and private spaces. He demonstrated that influence need not shout and courage need not be loud. His life suggested that identity, resilience, and subtle audacity could persist long after the spectacle of the arena faded. As Hercules Maximus approached the later years of life, his presence in Rome became quietly legendary. A familiar figure in the city's streets, courtyards, and baths, he had settled into routines that balanced observation, reflection, and gentle influence. The world continued its noisy, chaotic rhythm, vendors shouting over each other, philosophers gesturing at passers-by, chariots rattling along stone roads, yet he moved through it all with calm, authority, and steady purpose. Physical training remained a subtle but vital part of daily life. Exercises focused on balance, flexibility, and precision rather than raw strength or spectacle. Footwork drills, sword handling, and posture exercises were performed in private courtyards or halls with a few trusted companions who sought guidance. The emphasis was on control, awareness, and meditative practice rather than performance. Observing younger gladiators, he offered quiet advice, adjusting stance or grip with minimal words. His instruction carried the weight of experience and the unspoken authority of someone who had survived the extremes of combat and captivity. Socially, Hercules Maximus continued to navigate both elite and ordinary circles with measured skill. Invitations to banquets, private parties, and informal gatherings persisted, though often ceremonial rather than essential. He spoke rarely, choosing words deliberately sprinkled with dry wit or gentle humor. Listeners often noticed the calm authority he projected, not through volume or gestures, but through a quiet confidence that suggested mastery of both self and social expectation. His presence subtly commanded attention without ever demanding it. Cultural commemoration continued to expand. Graffiti, statues, mosaics, and inscriptions captured both Hercula, the female gladiator, and Hercules Maximus, the man showcasing skill, poise, and audacity. Public admiration ranged from playful to reverent, humorously acknowledging his dual identity or marveling at his ability to exist authentically in multiple forms. This blend of fascination, humor, and admiration reinforced his unique cultural footprint, one that would endure beyond the immediate spectacle of his early career. Bathhouses remained essential spaces for both observation and social interaction. The steam-filled rooms offered opportunities to witness human behavior, converse quietly, and occasionally provide guidance without attracting attention. Observing gossip and the ebb and flow of conversation, Hercules Maximus could subtly influence understanding and social dynamics while maintaining discretion. His presence evoked quiet respect not through dominance, but through calm, intentional engagement. Personal and romantic relationships continued to be handled with discretion letters. Inscriptions and surviving anecdotal references suggest companionships that were intellectually and emotionally engaging. Relationships emphasized mutual respect and authenticity rather than social performance or public acclaim. Maintaining privacy in these connections allowed him to preserve autonomy while cultivating meaningful intimacy despite the ever-present curiosity of Roman society. Mentorship remained a cornerstone of his later years. He guided young freed gladiators, aspiring fighters, and individuals navigating social complexities, offering advice on technique, self-discipline, and identity management. His approach was deliberate and measured, allowing protégés to learn independently while benefiting from subtle guidance. The combination of practical skill, philosophical reflection, and social insight created a mentorship style that was both effective and quietly inspiring. Political dynamics occasionally intersected with his life. Despite envy or subtle hostility from some senators and courtiers, Hercules Maximus rarely engaged directly, preferring discretion, observation, and the quiet authority of presence. Over time, his measured interactions and subtle influence allowed him to navigate potential conflicts without overt confrontation. He had honed this skill over decades in both the arena and elite society, achieving a rare form of social resilience. Evenings were devoted to reflection. Walking through streets, gardens, and public spaces, observing shadows, light, and human movement allowed contemplation of identity, legacy, and influence. These walks reinforced continuity and grounded him in both the past and the present. As he moved through the city, he considered the delicate balance he had maintained between private authenticity and public expectation, between influence and discretion, and between resilience and vulnerability. Finally, Hercules Maximus maintained a loyal and discreet network of friends and confidants. Many were former gladiators, others ordinary citizens inspired by his life story. Relationships were nurtured with care, balancing engagement and autonomy, admiration and authenticity. This network reinforced both his personal freedom and cultural legacy, allowing him to remain connected without being consumed by public attention. Ultimately, the enduring appeal of Hercules Maximus lay in the quiet mastery of life itself. Not through dramatic heroics or spectacle, but through measured courage, deliberate choice, and subtle influence. His legend persisted in graffiti, art, poetry, and oral narrative, not as tales of violence, but as lessons in authenticity and resilience. A life fully lived on one's own terms, demonstrating that identity, influence, and courage can endure long after the arena's sands have been swept away. In the final chapters of Hercules Maximus' life, Rome continued to buzz around him, but he had by now achieved a remarkable degree of equilibrium. The city remained loud, chaotic, and entirely indifferent to any one individual. As personal drama, yet he navigated it with a calm precision cultivated over decades of survival, combat, and subtle influence. Even the most distracted citizen would notice him moving with measured grace through markets, courtyards, and public gardens, and feel that quiet weight of presence. Without understanding exactly why, daily routines remained soothingly predictable. Morning training, though lighter than in youth, preserved strength and balance. Footwork, sword drills, and meditative exercises provided rhythm and discipline without spectacle. His body, once honed for combat and survival, was now a testament to careful maintenance and respect rather than arena dominance. Companions occasionally joined him for practice, learning not only the motions but the patience, calm, and attention to detail that made Hercules Maximus more than just a fighter. He was a teacher, a mentor, and a quietly commanding presence. Public and social life continued to be managed with careful attention. Invitations to banquets and parties persisted, but these were more ritual than necessity. Hercules Maximus rarely sought attention, instead allowing observers to notice him, marvel quietly, and sometimes be inspired without interference. Conversation remained minimal but measured with wry humor and subtle insight. His words were rare yet weighty, spoken with a rhythm that conveyed calm authority and long experience. The ability to exist publicly without being consumed by spectacle was perhaps his most extraordinary skill. Graffiti, mosaics, inscriptions, and statues continued to cement his cultural impact. Pompeii and other towns remained particularly rich with public remembrance of Hercula, the Gladiator, and Hercules Maximus, the man. Citizens carved, painted, and wrote in playful admiration, celebrating his duality and audacity. Humor and reverence mingled in these tributes, reflecting both disbelief and respect. The combination of physical prowess, intellect, and subtle social skill created a footprint that outlasted fleeting spectacle and survived into legend. Bathhouses retained their importance as both social and observational arenas. The steam and warmth allowed quiet conversations, careful observation of human behavior, and occasional subtle guidance. His presence commanded respect not by dominance, but by quiet authority, empathy, and attention to nuance. These spaces reinforced both his understanding of human nature and the social rhythms of the city, while allowing him to remain largely undisturbed by the constant curiosity of onlookers. Personal and romantic relationships were discreet yet meaningful letters. Inscriptions and anecdotes suggest companions who valued intellect, humor, and authenticity above fame or spectacle. Relationships were conducted with care, balancing intimacy and autonomy, allowing Hercules Maximus to maintain meaningful connection without being overwhelmed by public scrutiny. Observers occasionally speculated about these private bonds, yet he managed perception with subtlety, preserving both privacy and dignity. Mentorship continued to occupy a significant portion of his time. Freed gladiators, young aspirants, and ordinary citizens sought guidance not only on combat skill but also on social navigation and personal authenticity. His approach was deliberate, observational, and patient. Advice was offered sparingly, allowing growth while modeling the principles of measured courage, subtle influence, and authenticity. The influence extended beyond practical instruction to philosophical reflection on identity, resilience, and the quiet mastery of life. Political pressures occasionally intersected with his life, though rarely directly. He deftly navigated envy, subtle hostility, and social tension, relying on patience, observation, and the quiet weight of presence, rather than confrontation. He employed subtle influence through timing, composure, and careful interaction, drawing on decades of experience from both the arena and elite social circles. Hercules Maximus ensured he maintained autonomy while subtly shaping perception and legacy. Evenings remained reserved for reflective walks, observing shadows. Public activity and the play of light and movement across the city offered opportunities for contemplation. He reflected on dual identity, legacy, personal influence, and cultural resonance. The careful balance of public persona and private authenticity had become both habit and art, a rhythm that persisted regardless of external attention or circumstance. In the final acts of his life, he maintained a small but loyal circle of friends and confidants. Former gladiators, curious citizens, and companions formed a network of trust, and quiet support relationships were nurtured with patience, discretion, and mutual respect, allowing him to exert influence and receive companionship without compromising autonomy. His social and personal life was carefully curated to sustain both connection and personal freedom. Upon his passing, Hercules Maximus was commemorated in ways befitting both Hercula the gladiator and Hercules Maximus the man. Statues depicted both identities, while inscriptions and graffiti celebrated audacity, courage, and authenticity. Accounts mention that he was buried with both a sword and a mirror, symbolic of his martial skill and self-reflection of his public triumphs and private authenticity. It was a life remembered not for violent spectacle, but for subtle mastery, deliberate choice, and quiet courage. The legacy of Hercules Maximus endured long after the sand of the arena was swept away. Graffiti, statues, mosaics, poetry, and oral narratives preserved the duality of his identity. His measured influence and his quiet audacity. A gladiator, a freedman, a celebrity, and a mentor, he became a cultural icon, not through force but through deliberate authenticity. The story of the one who fought in a metal bikini, lived as a man, and left an enduring mark on Rome suggests that courage, identity, and influence can persist quietly and profoundly in ways that survive the spectacle of history. And so ends the tale of Hercules Maximus, a figure who defied expectation, lived authentically, and left the world richer for it. His life reminds us that the quiet mastery of existence, Subtle influence and courage can create a legacy far greater than mere fame or notoriety. It is a story of choice, resilience, and audacity gently unfolding across the noise of history, leaving behind whispers, statues, and inscriptions that still speak of a life extraordinary in its calmness. In 2nd century Rome, a captured Germanic warrior known as Hercula fought as a female gladiator in a metal bikini, winning 47 battles and captivating the city. She later bought her freedom, transitioned to live as a man Hercules Maximus, and quietly became Rome's first transgender celebrity. Praised in graffiti, statues, and poetry, admired by emperors, and beloved by citizens, Hercules Maximus navigated fame, love, mentorship, and society with calm, subtle authority. His life was not defined by spectacle but by authenticity, courage, and the delicate mastery of identity, a legend remembered for both sword and mirror, power and self-reflection. Did Hercules Maximus inspire Rome or just shock it? Hit that like button if you're fascinated by the gladiator who defied every expectation, and subscribe to uncover more untold legends from history. Don't forget to turn on the bell, because the next story might just rewrite everything you thought you knew about the past.